The man who built a billion-dollar empire from spare parts had just been thrown out of his own building like yesterday's trash. This scrapyard mechanic has no place at the table. Take your greasy toolbox and get out. Victoria Hale said it loud enough for every investor and staffer packed into the mezzanine of the Atlantic Avenue headquarters to hear. Her Louboutin heels clicked once as she turned away, Cartier watch flashing under the overhead lights, Brioni jacket tailored to perfection. 24 suited witnesses smirked behind their branded coffee cups. Elias Kane stood frozen in his oil-stained Carhartt, knuckles still raw from the brake job at 6 that morning, the scarred metal toolbox heavy in his grip. Rain hammered the glass walls behind him. He didn't speak. He simply closed the latches on the box, turned, and walked out into the pouring Boston morning. She had no idea the man she had just humiliated in front of 24 witnesses was the only reason her billion-dollar company still ran at all. What exactly was hiding inside that greasy toolbox? 5 years earlier, Elias Kane had been the original founder-engineer of what became Hale Dynamics. He had written the core architecture in the same one-bay garage on Dorchester Avenue while his infant daughter Lily slept against his chest between late-night commits. The smell of solder and baby powder still lived in his memory. Victoria, then a sharp-suited vice president in those same Louboutins and that Cartier, had convinced the board that a rough-edged Southie inventor with no Ivy League pedigree would scare off the institutional money. One closed-door vote. One quiet payout of $2.4 million that barely covered the funeral costs after his wife died. And just like that, Elias was erased. He let them believe he had simply vanished. It was quieter that way, cleaner for raising Lily alone. He reopened Kane Auto on the corner of Dorchester and Atlantic. Changed oil filters by day, rebuilt the patents and the proof by night. Lily grew up thinking her dad loved the sound of engines catching and the smell of fresh 10W40. She never questioned the framed 2016 patent that hung above the tool chest like a family photo. Then came that rainy Thursday morning. Victoria had called an emergency strategy session at the headquarters she now commanded. The building still used the exact reinforced concrete beams Elias had spec'd himself in 2016. Her new efficiency protocol kept crashing the legacy kernel. 3 senior engineers had already failed, so she demanded the original architect's notes. Legal remembered the name Kane. They found him under a lifted Civic at 10:17 a.m., radio playing low Sinatra, Lily's threadbare stuffed bear perched on the workbench exactly where it had sat for every all-nighter since she was 2. Victoria barely looked at him before the sneer set in. "Still playing with wrenches, Mr. Kane? How quaint." She demanded the binders. He slid out from under the car, wiped his hands on a rag that had seen better decades, and met her eyes for the first time in 5 years. The investors watched via video link. Victoria raised her voice so the entire mezzanine and every screen could hear. "This scrapyard mechanic has no place at the table. Take your greasy toolbox and get out." The laughter that followed rattled the steel roof like loose change. Elias said nothing. He latched the scarred metal box, walked past her through the downpour, and let the door seal behind him with a soft hydraulic hiss. But as cold rain soaked his shoulders, the smallest private smile touched his mouth, because that toolbox held no wrenches today. Inside it rested a decrypted drive. Every original commit, every timestamp, every offshore wire that had quietly financed her coup, and a dormant master key that could wake the entire empire if triggered. 3 days later, the first small reversal arrived. Day 3, 2:14 a.m. The garage on Dorchester Avenue was silent except for the low hum of the hanging bulb and the occasional drip from the leaky roof. Lily's stuffed bear sat on the corner of the workbench, one button eye missing, fur worn thin from years of silent watch duty. Elias opened the battered laptop. The red error banner that had locked every executive engineer out of the flagship software for 48 straight hours glowed on the screen like a challenge. He typed 6 precise lines of code. The screen flickered once. The error vanished. The efficiency protocol executed flawlessly. Across town in the glass tower, every monitor on the 34th floor refreshed at once. Victoria's team erupted in relieved cheers. Frantic congratulatory emails flew to the genius contractor they had hired the day before. None of them knew the contractor was the same grease-stained mechanic they had laughed out of the building 72 hours earlier. Elias closed the laptop, set the stuffed bear gently on top of it, and allowed himself one slow breath. The first quiet piece of the debt had been collected. No one had seen it. No one had applauded. But the foundation had just reminded the building who poured the concrete. Day 7. A small LLC registered in Lily's name purchased 180,000 microshares at $41.12 each. The transaction was perfectly legal, perfectly invisible. The filing listed the buyer simply as Kane Family Trust, 2016 patents. Day 12. A second LLC bought 312,000 shares at $38.74. The stock ticked downward another 1.8% by close of market. Victoria's compliance team flagged nothing. Her general counsel received an anonymous packet in the mail containing 3 wire confirmations totaling $41.7 million routed through Cayman accounts during the original takeover. The packet carried no return address, only the faint smell of motor oil on the envelope. Day 19. 19 hours to the first quarterly filing deadline. Victoria stood in her corner office, Patek Philippe catching the afternoon light, and fired her lead counsel in front of the entire strategy team. The stock slid another 2% before lunch. She told the board it was normal market volatility. The board nodded, but the whispers had already started. The name Kane, spoken now with a different tone. All the while Elias kept the garage lights on at 6:45 a.m. sharp. He rotated tires for the neighborhood regulars, helped Lily practice her multiplication tables at the counter, and never once mentioned the folder that grew thicker each night behind the workbench. Lily, 8 years old and sharper than most adults, sensed the change. Every evening she would place the threadbare stuffed bear beside his laptop before skipping off to bed. "Bear says you got this, Dad." Elias would nod, position the bear so its missing eye faced the screen, and keep typing. The grind was slow, methodical, one line of code, one quiet share, one anonymous tip at a time. And with every passing day, the pressure beneath Victoria's polished surface grew exactly like rust on a bridge no one else could yet see. Day 26. Another LLC purchased 240,000 shares at $34.19. The restored patents, all 287 of them originally filed the year Lily was born, began triggering automatic royalty recalculations. $178,000 flowed into the Kane Family Trust before noon. Victoria replaced her entire engineering vice president by 3 p.m. The stock dropped another 4% by the closing bell. She still had no idea the man she had publicly dismissed was tightening the noose from the same garage where he once rocked his daughter to sleep. The toolbox sat closed on the bench each night. The stuffed bear kept watch beside it. And the debt continued to mount, one careful, invisible beat at a time. The packet slipped through the mail slot at 6:17 a.m. No stamp, no return address. Only that same faint trace of motor oil clinging to the craft paper. Day 33. 17 hours until the next board call. Victoria paced the marble floors of the executive suite in her Brioni suit, the fabric whispering with each step. Her voice cracked like thin ice when she fired the compliance officer in front of 3 analysts who had flown in from Chicago. "You're useless here. Take your box and go." The words hung in the air like cheap cologne. Stock dipped another 3.5% before the markets even opened. She told the remaining team it was noise. They smiled the way people smile at someone standing too close to the edge. But the name Kane was no longer a whisper. It was starting to echo. Elias never broke rhythm. At 6:45 a.m., sharp the garage lights buzzed on. He slid under a rusted Civic for Mrs. Alvarez, replaced her brake pads for $43 cash, and listened to her complain about the price of milk. Lily sat at the counter doing long division, the threadbare stuffed bear propped beside her pencil case like a silent referee. Every so often she would glance at her father, eyes narrowed the way only an 8-year-old who has already lost one parent can narrow them. That night, the bear stood guard again. Elias positioned its one good eye toward the laptop screen while he uploaded the next tranche of rediscovered schematics. 219 patent citations now active. The Kane family trust balance ticked past $412,000. He closed the laptop at 2:14 a.m., folded the newest packet, and tucked it beneath the bear's worn paw. The smell of motor oil lingered on his fingers. Day 41. 14 hours until the SEC preliminary review. Victoria's assistant found the latest royalty notice on the conference table at 8:03 a.m. The numbers were impossible. $347,000 in recalculated licensing fees from 3 separate offshore entities that no one could trace. She slammed the report down so hard her Patek Philippe left a faint scratch on the glass. "Find whoever is doing this," she hissed at what was left of her senior counsel. "Or you can all join the last 3 on the sidewalk." The new outside law firm billed her $280,000 in the first 48 hours. They produced nothing but more questions. Victoria started sleeping with her phone on the pillow. At 3:07 a.m., the unread texts from the board chair glowed like accusations. Elias woke at 5:50 a.m. to the sound of Lily crying in the next room. Another nightmare about the car accident that took her mother. He carried her to the garage, wrapped her in an old wool blanket that still smelled like transmission fluid, and let her fall asleep on the battered couch while he worked. The toolbox stayed closed, but he slid one more document across the bench. A single page. Page 17 of the original incorporation papers. The one with his own faded signature at the bottom. He stared at it for a long time, then placed the stuffed bear on top of it like a paperweight. By sunrise, he had triggered another automatic share acquisition. 164,000 shares at $29.11. The trust now controlled 9.4% of the company. Enough to file a formal 13D. He didn't file it. Not yet. The grind continued. Day 49. 11 hours until the emergency shareholder circular had to be approved. Victoria stood on the 42nd floor balcony at 6:42 a.m., designer heels in one hand, cigarette in the other, even though she had quit 6 years ago. The city smelled like rain and jet fuel. Her phone buzzed with the latest update. Another quiet LLC had just crossed the 10% ownership threshold. The filing was due in 11 hours. If the circular went out without naming the new stakeholder, the SEC would open an inquiry by Monday. If she named them, she would have to admit she had no idea who they were. She stubbed the cigarette out on the concrete ledge and went inside. Fired her head of investor relations at 7:19 a.m. in front of the entire communications staff. The woman's trembling signature on the severance agreement left a small ink blot that looked like a tear. Victoria told herself it was necessary. The stock had fallen to $26 and change. Her Brioni jacket suddenly felt too tight across the shoulders. Meanwhile, Elias rotated snow tires for the retired fire captain down the block. Took $67 and a 6-pack of beer as payment. Lily helped him torque the last lug nut to 78 foot-pounds, her small hands wrapped around the breaker bar. When they were done, she placed the stuffed bear on the driver's seat of the finished truck, so he can test drive it. The bear's missing, I seemed to stare straight at Elias, reminding him of the promise he had made the night he carried his wife's ashes out of the hospital. That evening, the garage smelled of fresh coffee and solder. Elias soldered one more circuit board for an old ham radio set he had rebuilt from parts. The call sign taped to the chassis read K7 Delta 9. He hadn't used it in 9 years. He keyed the mic once, heard the old familiar static, and felt something loosen in his chest. Then he killed the power and positioned the bear beside the radio. Another packet arrived at 9:43 p.m., same faint motor oil scent. He added it to the growing folder without opening it. The noose was tightening, one deliberate tug at a time. Day 57. 8 hours until the quarterly filing deadline. Victoria arrived at the office at 4:50 a.m. to find the entire legal department already assembled like a firing squad that had turned on its general. The latest anonymous filing had landed at 3:22 a.m. 14 previously buried patents now generating $489,000 in back royalties. The Kane Family Trust was listed as the sole beneficiary. One of the younger associates actually laughed when Victoria demanded an explanation. She fired him on the spot. The laugh died in the hallway. She locked herself in the corner office, kicked off her $400 heels, and stared at the city waking up below. For the first time, the Patek Philippe on her wrist felt heavy. She picked up her phone, thumb hovering over a number she hadn't dialed in years. Then she set it down again. The whispers had become voices. The name Kane was no longer a question. It was starting to sound like an answer. Back in the garage, the lights clicked on at 6:45 a.m. Elias handed Lily her lunchbox and watched her climb onto the school bus. The stuffed bear rode in her backpack today, one floppy ear sticking out like a flag of truce. He waited until the bus turned the corner before he opened the newest packet. Inside was a single photograph. Him and his wife on the day the first patent was granted. Lily wrapped in a blanket between them. On the back, in handwriting he still recognized, were 3 words, "They never knew." He placed the photo beneath the bear's paw on the workbench, right next to the growing folder. The smell of motor oil mixed with the memory of his wife's perfume. The grind had entered its next phase. Day 64. 5 hours until the board would have to vote on emergency financing. Victoria's voice shook for the first time in the executive conference room when she learned that 3 major suppliers had quietly rerouted their contracts through a new holding company. The holding company's listed address was a P.O. box in the same town where Elias ran his garage. She canceled the vote, told the directors the numbers needed more review. They left without saying goodbye. The stock closed at $21.14. Her corner office suddenly felt very small. At 2:07 a.m., she sat alone with a bottle of 23-year-old scotch she had been saving for a celebration that would never come. The unread text from the chairman glowed on her phone. "We need to talk about Kane." She did not reply. Elias kept the garage lights burning until 4:12 a.m. He had just triggered the next quiet purchase. Another 237,000 shares. The trust now sat at 14.8%, close enough to call a special meeting. He still did not call it. Instead, he picked up the stuffed bear, brushed the dust from its fur, and whispered the same 4 words he had said to it every night since the humiliation began. "Soon, little man. Soon." The debt was almost ready to be paid in full. But not tonight. Day 71. Only 2 hours remained until the emergency shareholder meeting would be announced. Victoria stood at the window again, watching the first light touch the buildings across the street. Her Italian shoes were scuffed for the first time in years. The Patek had stopped at 5:58 a.m. She had forgotten to wind it. The name Kane was now spoken in every hallway, every elevator, every late-night strategy call. And still she had no face to attach to it. Only the growing sense that the man she had thrown away like scrap was somehow sitting at the other end of every move she made. In the garage, the lights came on at the usual time. Elias rotated tires for the morning rush, helped Mrs. Alvarez again, listened to Lily read her latest spelling list aloud while the stuffed bear sat on the counter like a tired judge. The folder behind the workbench was now 3 inches thick. The scent of motor oil had soaked into every page. He placed one last document on top of the pile, a single sheet, the original termination letter Victoria had handed him 18 months earlier. Her signature was perfect. His name was underlined twice in red. He set the bear on top of it, its missing eye aimed directly at the words. Then he closed the toolbox, turned the lights off early, and waited for the next packet to arrive. The grind had become a countdown neither of them could stop. Day 78. The next envelope slid through the mail slot at 6:12 a.m. This one was thicker, heavier, the motor oil smell stronger than ever. Elias picked it up without opening it. He already knew what it contained. The last piece, the one that would force the public arena. He carried it to the workbench, laid it beside the bear, and for the first time in weeks allowed himself a small, tired smile. The debt was almost due. The lights stayed on. The bear kept watch, and the slow, methodical collection continued, one invisible beat at a time. Day 79. The envelope lay unopened on the workbench until the morning rush had thinned. Elias wiped his hands on a rag that smelled of brake cleaner and old leather. He slit the seal with a box cutter. Inside were photocopies of board minutes from 3 years earlier, pages he had never been meant to see. His own name appeared in the margins, circled in the handwriting of the original founder. Victoria's signature was there too, smaller, approving the quiet removal of the man who had designed the entire routing algorithm the company still ran on. He read it once, folded it, slid it under the stuffed bear's worn paw. The missing eye stared back at him like it always did. At 10:17 a.m. his phone buzzed. Unknown number. He let it ring 4 times before answering. Mr. Kane. A young voice, nervous. This is Rachel from legal. Ms. Hargrove asked me to schedule a mediation. She believes there may have been an oversight in your separation agreement. Elias looked at the bear. Tell her I'll be there. Tomorrow, 10 sharp. Her conference room. He hung up before she could reply. Day 80. Victoria arrived at the office at 6:45 wearing the same scuffed Italian shoes. The Patek was still stopped at 5:58. She had not wound it. In the elevator, she caught her reflection and noticed the faint tremor in her left hand. She pressed it flat against her thigh. The conference room smelled of fresh coffee and panic. 3 lawyers sat on her side of the long oak table. Elias arrived at 9:58 wearing the same coveralls he had worn the day she fired him. Grease still darkened the cuffs. He carried nothing but a plain manila folder and the faint scent of motor oil that seemed to travel with him now like a signature. He did not sit. Victoria cleared her throat. Mr. Kane, we're prepared to offer a substantial settlement. 800,000. Immediate wire. Full NDA. No admission of wrongdoing. Elias placed the folder on the table. Opened it. The first page was the original termination letter. Her signature perfect. His name underlined twice in red. He slid it across the polished surface until it stopped directly in front of her. This isn't about money, he said quietly. This is about the algorithm you've been licensing for $42 million a year. The one I wrote in seat 18C on a red-eye from Frankfurt in 2017 while my daughter was in the ICU. The one you told the board you developed after I was gone. One of the lawyers started to speak. Elias raised a single grease-stained finger. The room went still. Day 81, he said. That's when the first patent refiling hits the public database. Under my name, with the original timestamps. Your licensing deals become complicated after that. He left the folder where it was, turned, walked out. The bear had stayed behind on the workbench back at the garage. But Victoria would later swear she felt its one-eyed stare the entire time he spoke. Day 82. The first leak appeared on an industry message board at 2:14 a.m. A scanned page of the 2017 flight log. Seat 18C. Passenger Elias M. Kane. Occupation listed as consulting engineer. Attached was a one-line comment. The man you fired still owns the engine. By breakfast, the thread had 400 replies. Victoria's inbox filled with panicked messages from 3 different VPs. She read them in her car outside the building, engine running, Italian shoes tapping the brake pedal in an uneven rhythm. The Patek on her wrist still read 5:58. Day 83. Elias stood in the garage bay at 7:03 a.m. changing the oil on Mrs. Alvarez's ancient Corolla. The radio played low. Lily sat on the counter swinging her legs, The stuffed bear balanced on her lap like a co-pilot. Its missing eye had been patched with a button Lily found in her mother's old sewing kit. Mismatched, slightly crooked. It gave the bear a permanent look of mild surprise. The folder was now 4 inches thick. Every new document smelled more like motor oil than paper. At 9:40 a.m., new mini-crisis arrived in the form of a sleek black town car that pulled up outside the open bay doors. 2 men in Brioni suits stepped out. Not lawyers, board members, Victoria's inner circle. The same 2 who had stood behind her the day she fired him. The taller one, Richard Lang, CFO, adjusted his Patek and tried for a friendly smile that did not reach his eyes. "Mr. Kane, we were hoping we could speak privately. Before this becomes irreversible." Elias wiped his hands slowly. The rag left fresh black streaks across his knuckles. He looked at Lily. She clutched the bear tighter. "Anything you say to me, you can say in front of my daughter," he answered. Lang's smile faltered. "This concerns several $100 million in licensing revenue. Perhaps the child could. She stays." The second man, a wiry operations director named Patel, stepped forward. "We're prepared to restore your position. Vice President of Engineering. Equity package. Back pay for 18 months. All of it." Elias considered them for a long second. Then he reached behind the workbench and pulled out the original cardboard box he had carried out the day he was fired. It still had the same coffee stain on one corner. Inside were the same items, except now the folder rested on top like a lid. He set the box on the floor between them. 18 months ago, you watched her hand me this box and call me scrap metal. Today, you want to hand it back like nothing happened. That's not how this works." He nudged the box forward with his boot until it touched the toe of Lang's spotless Italian shoes. "Day 84, Elias said. "That's when the second patent surfaces. The one that covers the predictive routing layer. The one that makes the first patent worthless without it. And I'm the only living signature on the original filing." Patel's face went pale. Lang actually took one involuntary step backward. Elias picked up the box again, carried it inside, set it on the workbench beside the bear. The mismatched button. I seemed to watch the 2 executives through the open bay door as they climbed back into the town car and drove away. Lily slid off the counter and hugged his leg. "Are they mad at you, Daddy?" "No, sweetheart," he said, resting a hand on her hair. "They're just starting to understand what they threw away." Day 85. Victoria stood alone in her corner office at 11:19 p.m. The city lights outside the window flickered like they always had, but tonight they looked colder. The termination letter lay on her desk where she had placed it after the mediation. She had not been able to throw it away. Her phone buzzed. A new email from the patent office. Public notice of refiling. Inventor Elias M. Kane. Signee none. The timestamp on the original submission was listed as 3:47 a.m. The exact hour Lily had been in emergency surgery 3 years earlier. She opened the attached PDF. At the bottom of the filing page was a small scanned image someone had added as a courtesy note. Probably Elias himself. It showed a folded piece of paper tucked into the paw of a one-eyed stuffed bear. The paper was the termination letter, her signature clearly visible. Victoria sat down hard in her leather chair. For the first time in her career, the trembling in her left hand would not stop. She stared at the image until the motor oil scent seemed to rise off the screen and fill the sterile office air. She picked up the Patek, wound it slowly. The second hand jerked forward once, twice, then settled into its smooth sweep. Outside, the city kept moving. Inside the garage on 9th and Industrial, the lights were already off. Elias sat in the dark with Lily asleep against his shoulder and the bear resting on the growing folder like a patient sentinel. Day 86. The boardroom on the 32nd floor smelled of expensive cologne and fear. Victoria arrived last. Her Italian shoes clicked across the marble like a countdown. She had not slept. The Patek now read the correct time but felt heavier than it ever had. The agenda had one item: urgent intellectual property exposure. Halfway through the CFO's trembling presentation, the conference room door opened without a knock. Elias stepped inside, still wearing his coveralls. A fresh streak of grease ran across his left forearm like war paint. He carried nothing visible, but everyone in the room could smell the motor oil. He did not speak at first, simply walked to the head of the table and placed a single new document in front of Victoria. It was a printout of the latest patent application. Her own name appeared in the previous assignee field. His name now filled the correct inventor line in bold type. Then he reached into his breast pocket and pulled out the stuffed bear. Its mismatched button I caught the overhead lights. He set it gently on top of the document. The room was so quiet they could hear the bear's loose stitching creak as it settled. 17 days until the auction of the European licensing rights, Elias said, voice low and even. The one you scheduled without knowing the patents were never properly transferred. The one where every bidder will receive a courtesy packet in exactly 16 days, 11 hours. He looked directly at Victoria for the first time since walking in. And every person who watched me carry that cardboard box out of this building 18 months ago will be in that auction room. Watching. He left the bear where it was, turned, walked out. The door closed with a soft click that sounded louder than any gavel. Victoria stared at the one-eyed bear. Its mismatched button seemed to tilt slightly, as if asking a question she already knew the answer to. In the garage that evening, Elias added the latest boardroom photo, snapped by a discreet ally on the inside, to the folder. The scent of motor oil had long since conquered every page. He laid the termination letter on top once more, set the bear back in its place of honor. Lily came in from the small apartment upstairs carrying 2 juice boxes. She handed him one. They drank in silence while the city outside counted down the hours neither of them could stop. Day 87. A new mini-crisis arrived at 4:22 p.m. in the form of a certified letter delivered by a nervous courier who would not meet Elias's eyes. The document inside was a temporary restraining order. Victoria's legal team had moved in the night, claiming trade secret theft. The hearing was set for the morning of the auction itself. Elias read it twice. Then he carried the letter to the workbench, laid it beside the bear, and did the one thing no one expected. He smiled, because the order listed the exact patents in dispute. And by naming them publicly, Victoria had just triggered the mandatory disclosure clause in the original 2017 agreements. Agreements only Elias had ever seen. He picked up the phone, dialed a number he had not used in 18 months. A voice answered on the second ring. Deep, calm, familiar. Delta Actual, the voice said. Elias spoke 3 words. The bear is watching. Then he hung up. Back at corporate headquarters, Victoria stood at her window again. The Patek ticked correctly now, but she kept catching herself checking it anyway. The Italian shoes were beyond scuffing. The left heel had started to separate. She did not care. Her assistant knocked once and entered without waiting. Ma'am, the European bidders just received their information packets. 23 of them have already replied asking for clarification on the inventor dispute. And there's something else. Victoria turned. The assistant held up a small padded envelope. No return address. Postmarked from the garage on 9th and Industrial. Inside was a single Polaroid. It showed the stuffed bear sitting on top of the growing folder. Beneath the bear lay the restraining order she had filed only hours earlier. Someone had drawn a small red circle around the hearing date and written in careful block letters, "See you there." The scent of motor oil drifted faintly from the photograph. Victoria sank into her chair. The city lights outside blurred. For the first time, she allowed herself to whisper the question she had been avoiding for weeks. What else did I throw away that day? In the garage, the lights dimmed at the usual hour. Elias tucked Lily into bed with the bear beside her pillow. Its mismatched eye caught the night light and seemed almost warm. He returned to the workbench. The folder was now 5 inches thick. He added the Polaroid receipt and the courier's tracking number to the stack. Then he placed the original termination letter on top once more, smoothing it with grease-stained fingers. The debt was still growing, and the countdown continued. The envelope sat unopened for exactly 7 minutes. Elias finally slit the seal with a box cutter. Inside were 3 documents and 1 photograph. The first was the memo, crisp corporate letterhead, Victoria's signature bold at the bottom. The second was the email chain where the board had voted to rebrand the engine he had designed as Vision Series. The third was a single page from the original patent application. His name redacted, hers inserted in its place. The photograph showed the same stuffed bear, this time perched on the hood of a prototype truck at the company lot, its single good eye staring straight into the camera. A faint smear of motor oil ran across its left paw like war paint. He laid everything beside the bear on the workbench. The mismatched button on its chest had loosened again. He tightened it with a needle and thread while the city traffic began its morning growl outside. Day 89. Lily shuffled in at 7:12, still in dinosaur pajamas, rubbing sleep from her eyes. She saw the bear and smiled the small, quiet smile that always steadied him. "Daddy, Mr. Buttons looks serious today." Elias nodded once. "He's got important work." He handed her a bowl of cereal and watched her eat at the corner table while he copied every new page into the folder. 6 inches now. The scent of grease and old paper filled the garage like incense. At 9:47, the phone rang. Unknown number. He let it go to voicemail, then played it back on speaker while he wiped down a torque wrench. Victoria's voice, tight and lower than usual. "Elias, this is childish. Destroying company property, leaking documents. I'm giving you one last chance to stop before the hearing. Call me." The line clicked dead at 9:48. He saved the recording, labeled the file number 4472, and added it to the stack. The bear watched from its place of honor, one paw still faintly stained. Day 90. 19 hours until the next courier drop. The new envelope arrived at 11:03 a.m., heavier than the last. Elias wiped his hands on a rag that once belonged to his flight suit and carried it to the bench. Inside, the original flight logs from the 287 test missions he had flown before the company bought his patents. Every successful run, every near disaster he had pulled out of the sky, all stamped classified property of VR Dynamics. Someone had paper-clipped a sticky note to the top page. "You kept the bear. We kept the credit. Fair trade." The handwriting matched the block letters from the Polaroid. He felt the old pressure behind his eyes, the same feeling he used to get at 32,000 feet when an engine flameout threatened to turn the prototype into scrap. Calm. Procedural. He scanned each page, logged the chain of custody, then placed the sticky note beneath the bear's crooked button. The fabric smelled faintly of the same motor oil that now clung to every page in the folder. Lily came home from school at 3:35 carrying a drawing of a truck with wings. She taped it above the workbench without a word. The bear seemed to nod in the afternoon light. Day 91. The first public tremor arrived at 10:14 a.m. in the form of a terse email from the auction house. The sealed bid deadline for the prototype engine had been moved up. Victoria's lawyers were trying to accelerate the sale before the hearing. Elias read the message twice, then made a single phone call to a man whose name had not been spoken aloud in 11 years. The voice on the other end answered after one ring. "Call sign Ghost. Still breathing?" Elias allowed himself half a smile. "Still counting." He gave the man 6 precise numbers, a routing code, and hung up. By 2:47 p.m., the auction house received an amended bidder packet. The new entry listed a shell company registered in Delaware, seat 18C on the original test flight manifest. The minimum bid, $178,000 above the current high. The accompanying letter of credit was signed by the same man who once carried a stuffed bear in his go bag on every mission. Victoria learned of the bid at 4:22 p.m. Her assistant found her in the glass conference room on the 23rd floor, phone pressed to her ear, Italian heels tapping an uneven rhythm on the marble. The scent of her overpriced diffuser, sandalwood and regret, could not mask the tremor in her voice when she demanded to know who had placed the counter. The assistant could only shrug. Victoria ended the call, walked to the window, and stared at the distant smokestacks of the 9th and Industrial District. For the first time, the city lights looked smaller. Day 92, 12 days until the auction. Elias spent the morning teaching Lily how to check spark plug gaps with a feeler gauge. Her small hands were careful, the same way his had been at her age. When she asked why the big folder kept growing, he answered simply, "Some debts take time to collect." She accepted that, the way children accept gravity. At 1:19 p.m., another envelope slid through the mail slot. This one carried no scent of oil, only the clean, chemical smell of fresh laser print. Inside were the board minutes from the day they voted to terminate him. Victoria had abstained. One line had been highlighted in yellow, "Potential liability if original designer ever surfaces." Someone had drawn a tiny bear paw print in the margin. He added it to the stack without flourish. The folder now weighed enough to make the old workbench creak. The bear sat on top like a silent foreman, its single good eye reflecting the overhead fluorescence. Elias ran a thumb across the faded flight patch still sewn into the bear's back, the one that read Ghost 287. He left it there. The patch had survived 3 combat tours, 2 engine failures, and 1 very bad divorce. It would survive 13 more days. At 6:55 p.m., his phone buzzed with a text from an unrecognized number. The message contained only a photograph. Victoria standing alone in the company parking garage, Brioni jacket slung over one arm, staring at the empty space where his old toolbox used to sit. The timestamp read 2:14 a.m. Beneath the photo, 3 words, "I can't sleep." Elias did not reply. He placed the phone beside the bear and went back to work. The grind did not pause for insomnia. Day 93. The mini-crisis landed at 8:07 a.m. in the form of a process server in a cheap suit who rapped on the garage door with papers demanding Elias appear at an emergency injunction hearing. Tomorrow. Victoria's new move. Claim he was harassing her by returning stolen intellectual property. The server looked almost apologetic when he handed over the thick sheaf. Elias accepted it, signed the receipt, and closed the door without a word. Inside, he read every line while Lily practiced spelling at the corner table. The legal language was dense, but the intent was clear. Shut down the folder, silence the courier drops, end the countdown before the auction. He felt the old altitude calm settle in his chest. At 9:31, he made 2 calls. The first to a retired JAG lawyer whose call sign had once been Paperweight. The second to the same Delaware shell that had placed the $178,000 overbid. Both conversations lasted under 90 seconds. By 11:50 a.m., the process server received a counterpacket at his own office. Inside were 287 scanned flight logs, each stamped with timestamps that predated Victoria's entire tenure. A single sticky note on top read, "See you in court. Bring better ink." The bear, now positioned beside the new legal stack, wore the same faint oil stain on its paw like a medal. Day 94. 10 days to auction. Victoria arrived at the emergency hearing at 9 a.m. sharp, Patek Philippe glinting under the courtroom lights. Her lawyer spoke for 23 minutes about baseless intimidation and former employee delusions. The judge listened with the weary patience of a man who had heard it all. Then Elias's counsel, Paperweight in a faded navy suit, stood. He placed a single document on the bench, the original, unredacted patent application bearing Elias's signature in the lower right corner, dated 8 years before Victoria's first day. The judge adjusted his glasses. The courtroom fell so quiet the air conditioning sounded like jet turbines. Victoria's face did not change, but her left hand trembled once against the polished oak table. She glanced toward the back row where two former board members sat, the same men who had laughed the loudest on the day she fired him. They were not laughing now. The injunction was denied at 10:17 a.m. Elias was not even in the room. He was at the garage, tightening the final nut on a small-scale test rig he had built from scrap over the last 94 days. Lily held the flashlight steady, the bear sitting on a nearby stool like an inspector. When the rig hummed to life at 10:44, exactly the same harmonic signature as the original prototype, Elias allowed himself one slow exhale. The sound filled the garage like distant thunder. He added the court transcript to the folder the moment it arrived by courier at 1:22 p.m. The stack now measured 7.5 inches. The bear's crooked button had finally been replaced with a new one, brass, salvaged from an old flight jacket. It caught the light whenever the garage door opened, a small, steady gleam amid the growing evidence. Outside, the city moved on its ordinary rhythm. Inside, the collection continued, one page, one cent, one silent witness at a time. The public arena was 9 days away. The folder smelled more like motor oil than paper now, and the bear kept perfect, patient watch. Day 95. The next envelope came at dawn. Elias slid it open with the same pocket knife he once used on fuel lines at 10,000 feet. Inside lay a single sheet, the original licensing agreement between the company and a defense contractor, signed in his name, bearing the faded ink of a stamp that read, "Classified, Level 3. No note, just the paper, still carrying the faint trace of the same cigar smoke that had clung to the boardroom the day Victoria had called his work obsolete. He laid it atop the stack without ceremony. The folder now stood 8.25 inches tall. The brass button on the bear's chest flashed once as morning light cut through the garage window. Lily was already awake, barefoot on the cold concrete, clutching a thermos of coffee that smelled like chicory and worry. "They're going to say it's fake," she whispered. "They always do." Elias only nodded, the way a man does when he has heard the same storm forecast for 95 days straight. He handed her the bear. She placed it on the workbench like a silent co-pilot, exactly where it had sat during every late-night weld and every quiet calculation. 9 days to auction. Victoria received the scanned copy of the licensing agreement by 7:40 a.m. She read it once in the marble silence of her penthouse kitchen, then dropped it onto the island beside a half-eaten croissant that suddenly tasted like ash. Her assistant waited by the door, Italian heels clicking with nervous precision. Victoria didn't look up. "Get me the original signatories on a call. All of them, before lunch." The assistant nodded and disappeared. The Patek on Victoria's wrist read 7:52 when she finally poured the rest of her espresso down the sink. It smelled bitter all the way down the drain. Day 96. The first deposition notice arrived by courier at 8:15 a.m., addressed to Elias in care of the garage. Victoria's legal team wanted him under oath within 72 hours. The letter smelled of fresh toner and quiet panic. Elias read it aloud to the bear while he calibrated the voltage on the test rig for the third time that week. The small machine answered with a low, familiar growl, exactly the harmonic he had tuned on Mission 287, the one that had kept an entire squadron's avionics alive through an EMP test no one else thought survivable. Lily recorded the waveform on her battered laptop. The numbers matched the original prototype to 4 decimal places. She printed the graph, dated it 10:03 a.m., and slid it into the folder without a word. The stack ticked upward another 1/16 of an inch. The brass button winked. Across town, Victoria's head of engineering, fresh out of Stanford, Brioni cufflinks still stiff, stood in her office at 11:20 a.m. and tried to explain why the test rig's signature could not possibly be replicated by a man who had spent 4 years sweeping floors. Victoria cut him off with 2 fingers raised. "I don't pay you to explain the impossible. I pay you to make it stop." The young man left a faint trail of expensive cologne and fresh sweat behind him. She stared at the city skyline until the reflection of her own face in the glass looked like a stranger wearing her watch. Day 97. 19 hours until the next emergency motion. Elias woke at 4:12 a.m. to the sound of rain hammering the garage roof like distant rotor blades. He found Lily asleep on the old couch, the bear tucked under her arm, one small hand curled around its patched ear. The folder rested on the floor beside them, 9 inches high now, edges darkened by oil and time. He covered them both with a wool blanket that still carried the faint smell of jet fuel from the storage locker he had never emptied. Then he went back to work. By 6:50 a.m. he had isolated the exact voltage spike that had caused the original prototype to fail in field trials, the flaw only he had known how to correct. He wrote the solution on a single yellow legal pad, signed it with the same steady hand that once signed off on multimillion-dollar government contracts, and sealed it in a fresh envelope. The courier picked it up at 8:05. Victoria's team would open it at 9:37. The motion hearing that afternoon lasted 41 minutes. Victoria arrived in charcoal Armani, the Patek hidden beneath a crisp white cuff. Her lawyer argued that the new evidence was untimely and suspiciously convenient. Elias's counsel, still wearing the faded navy suit, countered by laying the yellow legal pad on the bench beside the original failure report from 8 years earlier. The judge's eyebrows rose a fraction. The court stenographer's fingers paused. In the gallery, the 2 former board members shifted in their seats. One of them loosened his tie as though the room had grown 20 degrees warmer. The motion was denied at 2:14 p.m. Victoria's left hand trembled again. Just once, against the oak. She did not look at the back row this time. Day 98. The folder smelled strongly of motor oil and solder now. Elias added the hearing transcript at 3:40 p.m., while Lily practiced her lines for the school play she had been too nervous to attend the year before. The bear sat on the stool, brass button catching the overhead bulb like a tiny navigation light. Elias let the child's quiet rehearsal fill the garage the way cockpit chatter once filled his helmet. The small victories kept coming, each one no louder than a socket wrench clicking into place. Victoria spent that evening alone in the boardroom that had once belonged to the man she fired. She poured 2 fingers of scotch at 9:18 p.m. and opened the folder her assistant had compiled. Every document Elias had quietly introduced over the last 98 days. The pages were arranged in perfect chronological order. She read them until the scotch was gone and the city lights outside blurred into runway markers she no longer recognized. At 11:47 p.m., she sent a single text to her lawyer. "How bad is it?" The reply came at 11:52. 3 words. She did not sleep. Day 99. 8 days until auction. The test rig passed its final stress cycle at 10:29 a.m. The harmonic held steady for 93 straight minutes, the same duration as the longest flight Elias had ever logged in the Seat 18C of a prototype that officially did not exist. Lily cheered so loudly the sound bounced off the corrugated walls like applause in a hangar. Elias allowed the corner of his mouth to lift, just once. He added the stress test log to the folder. 10 inches exactly. The bear watched from its stool, button gleaming, patched ear slightly cocked as if listening for the next beat in a rhythm only it understood. Victoria learned of the successful test at 1:05 p.m. from a panicked voicemail left by the same Stanford engineer, voice cracking on the words "exact match." She listened to it twice in the back of her town car while stuck in traffic on 4th Street, the leather seat suddenly too warm against her spine. She deleted the message, then immediately regretted it. The Patek read 122 when she told the driver to turn around. There was a storage unit on the edge of the industrial park she had not visited in 4 years. Something inside it had begun to call her name in a voice that sounded like distant thunder. Day 100. The courier arrived at the garage at 6:50 a.m. with a plain manila envelope. No return address. Inside was a single faded photograph. Elias in flight suit, helmet under one arm, standing beside the original prototype on a rain-slicked tarmac. The date printed in the corner read exactly 10 years earlier. On the back, in handwriting he recognized as his own, were 3 words and a small ink sketch of a teddy bear missing one button. He stared at it for a long minute, then placed the photo at the very front of the folder. The stack no longer fit neatly. It had begun to bow outward like a spine under too much weight. The brass button on the bear's chest caught the same angle of light that once glinted off cockpit glass at 39,000 feet. Lily found him still holding the photo at 7:12. She didn't ask questions. She simply climbed onto the workbench, placed the bear beside the picture, and rested her head on her father's shoulder. The garage smelled of coffee, solder, and the slow turning of a very old debt. Outside, the city kept its ordinary rhythm. Inside, the collection continued, 1 page, 1 cent, 1 silent witness at a time. The public arena was 7 days away. The folder had begun to smell like the inside of a hangar again, and the bear kept perfect, patient watch. Day 101. A new mini-crisis landed at 8 a.m. sharp. Victoria's team had obtained a temporary restraining order blocking any further disclosure of documents until the auction. The process server handed the papers to Elias while he was under the test rig, wrench still in hand. The metal felt suddenly cold against his palm. Lily stood frozen in the doorway, the bear dangling from one small fist. For the first time in 101 days, the garage went completely quiet, no hum, no click, no distant thunder. Only the sound of rain starting again on the metal roof. Elias read the order twice. Then he did something the process server would remember for years. He smiled. Not wide, not triumphant, just the small, knowing curve of a man who had flown through worse weather with worse odds. He thanked the server politely, closed the garage door, and turned to Lily. "Hand me the folder." She did. He removed the top 3 documents, the patent, the licensing agreement, the stress test log, and laid them on the workbench beside the bear. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number he had not used in 4 years. A voice answered on the second ring, rough with sleep and recognition. "Call signs still valid?" Elias asked. Pause. Then, always was ghost. The reversal was small, private, and enough. By 9:47 a.m., the restraining order had been challenged by a retired federal judge who owed Elias a favor from Mission 287. The challenge was filed under seal, but the seal carried the same classification stamp that once protected entire air wings. Victoria learned of it at 10:33 while her assistant laid a fresh shirt on the bed. Brioni, still in tissue paper. Her hand trembled against the silk. She canceled her 11 a.m. strategy meeting and drove herself to the storage unit instead. The key felt heavier than it should have. When she finally slid the corrugated door upward at 11:51, the scent that rolled out was unmistakable. Jet fuel, old paper, and the faint metallic tang of a life she had tried to bury under Italian shoes and Patek Philippe watches. Inside, untouched for 4 years, sat a single locked case. On top of it lay a child's drawing of a bear with one crooked button. The ink had faded, but the message on the back had not. Victoria read it aloud in the empty unit, voice barely above a whisper. The rain outside sounded exactly like rotor blades spinning up. Day 102, 6 days until auction. The folder had grown to 11¼ inches. Elias added the federal judge's filing at 2:18 p.m. while Lily practiced her lines again. Louder this time, the bear stationed on the stool like a patient audience of one. The test rig ran in the background, steady as a heartbeat. The city outside moved on its ordinary rhythm. Inside the garage, the collection continued, 1 page, 1 cent, 1 silent witness at a time. The brass button caught the light every time the door opened, small and steady, a navigation aid in the gathering dark. The public arena was closer now, and the debt, page by page, day by day, was almost ready to be paid in full. On the morning of the auction, Victoria entered the packed conference hall on the 32nd floor. Every seat was taken by the same investors and staffers who had smirked behind their coffee cups the day she threw Elias out. The European bidders waited on the video wall, their faces expectant. The auctioneer cleared his throat and began. Before the first bid could be called, the double doors opened. Elias walked in wearing clean coveralls, the scarred metal toolbox in one hand and the stuffed bear tucked under his other arm. The folder, now 12 inches thick and bound with heavy twine, rested inside the open toolbox. The scent of motor oil drifted across the room like a signature. He set the toolbox on the long oak table directly in front of Victoria. Then he placed the bear on top of it, its brass button eye-catching every light in the hall. The auctioneer froze. The room went silent. Elias spoke only once, voice low and even. 17 original patents. 287 supporting documents. 14.8% ownership through the Kane Family Trust. All royalty streams, all licensing rights, and every back payment now due and payable to the original designer. The auction is cancelled. The European rights revert to me, effective immediately. He opened the toolbox, lifted the bound folder, and set it in front of her. The termination letter sat on top, her signature crisp and damning under the overhead lights. Victoria stared at the bear, then at the folder, then at the man she had once called scrapyard trash. The tremor in her left hand had become permanent. The Patek on her wrist read the correct time but no longer mattered. Elias picked up the bear, tucked it gently under his arm, and closed the toolbox. He turned to the silent witnesses who had laughed that rainy morning 18 months earlier. Then he walked out of the building the same way he had entered it. Quiet, methodical, carrying nothing but the tools he had always needed. The debt was paid in full. Back at the garage that evening, the lights came on at 6:45. Elias rotated tires for Mrs. Alvarez, helped Lily with her spelling list, and listened to the low hum of the test rig running its final validation cycle. The stuffed bear sat on the workbench, brass button gleaming, one good eye watching the framed 2016 patent above the tool chest like an old friend. Lily placed a fresh cup of coffee beside him. "Bear says you got this, Dad." Elias smiled, small and tired and complete. He nodded once, positioned the bear so its button eye faced the laptop screen, and kept typing. The foundation had reminded the building who poured the concrete. And the man who built a billion-dollar empire from spare parts finally sat back down at his own table.